Okay, it looks like we are recording. So before we get started, I just wanted to kind of show you around the webinar. You all have access to a Q&A box. So if you have any questions, please use the Q&A box. We'll be keeping an eye on that. There's also a chat box, which I'll type into right now so that you can all see. You can use the chat box throughout our webinar to interact with each other. There will be moments throughout the webinar where we maybe ask you to type in the chat box. So if you have any questions about that, I have a couple of my teammates on the call who can help. But let's get started. All right, so thank you all for joining our webinar today. Our webinar today is called Providing Unrestricted Cash Grants to Survivors of Intimate Partner Violence. I'm very, very excited to talk to you all today. This is FreeFrom's first ever webinar hosted by us. We've done webinars with other folks, but this is our first one presented by us. I have a couple of my teammates on our call. For the most part, it'll be me and Sharon speaking. We do a lot of the service provider engagement and education for FreeFrom. So we directly work with service providers in the DV movement, in the gender-based violence movement, to really support them in building financial services and programming for their organizations. But we also have Kirkley Doyle and Diana Ayala on the call, who are our data geniuses and our accounting geniuses, and will help us answer some of your questions today. So let's get started.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. First, before we start the webinar, we do want to work through grounding. And we do this before each webinar, before our calls, just to make sure that we're all in a really safe and feeling really comfortable in the space that we are in. So we do want to start with, let's just kind of take a few deep breaths. You can close your eyes, you can keep them open if you want. And we really want you to feel comfortable during this webinar. So you sit comfortably, put your feet up, choose a body position that feels good for you. And then let's check in with yourself. So really think about, how are you feeling right now? And where are you feeling it in your body? What are you bringing into this moment, into this webinar with you today? And what are you hoping to leave behind? Give your thoughts a moment to think, give them space, allow your body to feel whatever it is feeling. And then when you're ready, please do come back to our webinar in a position that feels comfortable to you. If you need to lay down, if you need to take some more deep breaths, please do so. I do want to share with all of you that we will be talking about money today, and we will be talking about financial trauma in some instances of the webinar. So please, if at any point you feel uncomfortable or your body's starting to react in a way that you notice it, or maybe you won't notice it, just to really give yourself and your body that space to feel all of the feelings, all of those emotions, sit with it, and know that it's okay, because talking about money is difficult and it can be really challenging and hard. So when you are ready, take one final big deep breath and we will get started. Okay, so today for our agenda, we will be talking about an introduction to FreeFrom, first of all, just to introduce you to who we are. You may know us a little bit and some of the work that we do, but we want to give you a really brief overview of FreeFrom. And then we want to really delve into the Survivor Safety Fund. Why did we launch it? What is it? What was the report? What were the things that we learned from it? And then delving into, how do you start a safety fund for survivors yourself, for your organization, for your community? And within this safety survivor fund, we want to talk a little bit about what we learned, thinking about language and trauma-informed care, as well as considerations and examples from our fund yourself, so that you can take it and start a fund of your own. We'll also be sharing resources and then taking Q&A at the end. But if you have any questions that come up, please feel free to use the Q&A chat function. And we will be recording and sharing the PowerPoint after the presentation, so please look out for that. So a little bit about Freefrom, our approach to the work that we do. The work that we do is we're really trying to build a world where survivors have sustaining income, savings, as well as credit to build wealth and resources to support individual, intergenerational, and community healing. So what we're really looking at is trying to figure out how do we build sustainable support in long-term safety for survivors of gender-based violence. And we do this by looking specifically at taking the holistic approach using technology, peer-to-peer networks, training programs for shelters, policy advocacy, social enterprise models, and cross-sector solutions. So really taking a look at the gender-based violence movement as well as the asset building movement to work on economic independence and long-term safety for survivors of gender-based violence. And for this webinar specifically, we'll be delving into our Survivor Safety Fund. So this was our initiative that we launched when incidents of DV skyrocketed during COVID. And we launched this fund because what we noticed is that, and what we heard and we read was that DV incidents during COVID has skyrocketed, right? We all read the news about how when unemployment rockets and economic instability happens, DV incidents tend to rise in not just the US, but across the world. And because of the economic abuse that survivors sustained during gender-based violence, survivors were sometimes unable to access all kinds of money and resources that they previously may have had access to, or because of COVID no longer have access to. So this would be unemployment checks, maybe they lost their job, maybe they didn't get their stimulus check because they were undocumented, or they were unable to access the stimulus check that was sent to them. And we realized that throughout, as COVID was happening, this kind of fund didn't exist for survivors of gender-based violence. We saw funds for trans Black folks, we saw funds for students, we saw funds for undocumented people, we saw funds for artists, but what we didn't see was a national fund specifically for survivors of gender-based violence. And as we were trying to figure out solutions to how do we support survivors during this time by getting cash into their hands, and who are the resources and who are the organizations that are doing this work, we, at least on our level, we didn't see anyone on the national level doing this type of work. So we scrambled and we hustled and we put together a fund for a national kind of open application fund, open to all survivors of gender-based violence, to be able to apply for this grant because they were asking for the help. Survivors were asking. So in April 2020, we launched our safety fund, which was our really quick initiative to get cash directly to survivors of IPV. We ended up distributing over 1,000 unrestricted cash grants directly to survivors, so cash straight into their hands. And we collected 1,300 survey responses from survivors. And these survey responses were optional questions in our application that we'll talk about later on. And we ended up getting 1,300 responses from the various ways that they were going to use the money. And then the follow-up responses were how they used the money and how it impacted their lives during this moment of crisis. And all of our data collected was released in our report, hopefully that you've read or skimmed through. I will also be sharing this in our email later, called Survivors Know Best: How to Disrupt Intimate Partner Violence During COVID-19 and Beyond. And some of the key takeaways from our report is that the average amount that survivors say they need right now in order to stay safe is $730. Their top 3 needs were cash to spend as they need because they know best, utility bill relief, as well as credit and debt relief. And we shared more numbers. $1,280 was the average amount that survivors reported their harm jurors stealing from them each month. and almost $16,000 is the amount that survivors say that their harm doers takes out in coerced or fraudulent debt in their name each year. So after we provided all of our funds, we asked for a follow-up survey, again, optional follow-up survey. And some of the responses that we got, we offered kind of an open text of asking survivors, what did you do with this money and how did it impact you? And some of the stories that we received were talking about, the car payments, thinking about using how this $250 changed the trajectory of their next year, 5 years. So you can see the cash came in just in time to fix my car. Not having a vehicle makes it difficult to get groceries. I use EBT, so I can't order online. Also, my child's dad has threatened to keep her in custody or change custody when I don't have transportation to drop her off at court order time and location. So the timing of this grant was a huge relief. So just the $250 to support her and to make it unrestricted in fixing her car allowed her to keep custody of her children. All right, so I'm gonna turn it over to Tanya to talk more about how do you start a safety fund for survivors and what does that look like for all of you?
Thanks, Sharon. So yeah, very exciting things that we learned from the safety fund. So now we're going to jump into, I think what y'all are excited to learn is how do you start a safety fund for survivors. One thing I do want to mention is that Free From is a 501c3, but we have the advantage of not currently being funded through government grants. So we have a lot of flexibility, and I completely understand that some of y'all maybe not in the same situation. So we're going to share examples of how we did the safety fund, but please, use the examples to your advantage. Some of them may resonate, some of them might not, but we're just going to give you some of the things that we learned from doing the safety fund, and hopefully it can offer some meaningful advice or guidance to you all. Before we really get started, I want to talk a little bit about language and trauma-informed care. So I think all of us are pretty familiar with trauma-informed care, but I think one of the things that we maybe don't think about is how do we do that when we're talking to somebody for the first time via a survey online, right? And how do we incorporate some of this? So language has a lot of power, and it's important to be mindful and understand that language can be a tool that helps build trust and or easily break trust. So one of the things that we understood was that many of the survivors that were probably going to be applying for the grant have some sort of trauma related to applying for assistance. As you all know, as service providers, applying for assistance can be very complex, can force survivors to bring up their experience over and over again, force them to prove that they're in need, which can obviously cause some trauma for survivors. So we wanted to be different, and we really wanted to be intentional about what language we were using and how we were presenting everything on our survey or our application, so that we can build trust from the moment that we first interact with a survivor. So some of the language considerations we took was that this application was offered in both English and Spanish. One of the lessons we learned is that we want to expand these languages, and to build time to expand to more languages is important. Possibly partnering with language specific or cultural specific organizations who have more knowledge of other languages might be helpful. We use non-gendered language, also with the understanding that survivors can identify with a multitude of genders, and we wanted to be inclusive of them. So we stayed away from using she, he. We use more they. We use gender neutral pronouns that wouldn't, suggest a gender. We used an inclusive definition of survivor. So we understood that survivors have many different experiences, and that many different types of violence can lead to somebody identifying as a survivor. Some folks may have experienced it as a child by growing up with it in their home. Some of them may have experienced it as an adult, or maybe somebody knew somebody in their family who they witnessed experience violence. And to us, we really wanted to welcome all survivors who self-identified as a survivor to apply for this fund. We use people first language, which means we centered people's humanities over their identity. So, for example, my name is Tania Ventura. I am a survivor. I am queer. I am Latina. But before all of that, it's my name, right? So I'm a human first. So saying things like people who are survivors or folks with disabilities. but centering really the humanity and everything else as an identity. We tried very, very hard to not use nonviolent language, so language that could maybe remind somebody of violence. Sometimes we don't even notice it. This is new for me too, so I completely understand that nonviolent language can be a little bit difficult, but things like saying like broke free, right? That breaking in itself is a very violent word. We also gave very honest explanations. So every time we were asking a question, we were very clear about what was optional, what was mandatory, why we are asking the questions that we are, why we're using the language that we are. So we practiced honesty as much as we could and wrote out explanations for things on the survey. Trauma-informed care that we use, I already mentioned, understanding that folks were going to have trauma specifically around applying for assistance in the past. But other things that we use were things like having flexible payments, being very flexible about communication, which we'll get into in a little bit. We always asked ourselves, what do we actually need to fulfill these grants and what can be optional? We're very mindful of the power dynamic that happens between the person giving the money and the person asking for it, and understanding like how do we minimize any like power and control dynamics that can come into play in that type of relationship. So we were just really conscious of it and had a lot of conversations around that, and being honest about what was optional, what was mandatory to fill out, like I mentioned before, was really, really important in our application. So we're going to jump into some key considerations, and I do want to mention that you will all receive a PDF of like a checklist / roadmap, whatever you want to call it, that includes most of the things that we'll talk about here today. So don't worry if you don't get it all down. You'll also get this PowerPoint emailed to you afterwards, but we're just going to go over some key considerations and lessons learned featuring Free From Safety Fund to give you examples of how we answered some of these critical questions when we were building this out. Let me actually move this because I can't see. All right. So the first thing we're going to talk about is determining grant volume and capacity. So questions that you may be asking yourself around grant value and capacity, or that if you haven't and you want to start thinking about it, is how much money is available for disbursements. So how much money do you have available either in your organization or in your community to give grants? How much money do survivors need, and what is a meaningful amount? And these two will determine how many payments you will disperse in order to determine staff requirements to fulfill disbursements. So there's a portion about figuring how much money you're going to give, and then there's a portion about what's your organization or your community's capacity to do this. So things that you might want to consider here are who on your team will create the application, translate if needed, who will disseminate applications, who will process or approve applications, who will communicate with grantees, and who will track and disperse grants. So what we ended up doing in the safety fund is that we gave max $250 grants. And originally we did that because we were a little confused and also concerned about having to give out 1099s. So if any of you have that question about 1099s, we'll be happy to kind of chat about it in the Q&A. So go ahead and ask questions about that, and Diana is here to help. But we did 250 grants because even if somebody did 2 grants, so that means that they were afforded 2 grants during the duration of our safety fund open application period, it would still be under that 1099 requirement of $600. We also opened our applications as we fundraise. So there was moments in time in throughout these last couple of months where the application closed so that we can fundraise. And then depending on how much we fundraise, that's how many grants we had available. And I believe right now we actually do still have a few folks waiting on our wait list. So we are actively fundraising again so that we can open our applications up. A team of our staff also helped with different components. So I don't think we named it a committee, but we almost kind of had a committee of people working on this. So we quickly realized it was not a one-person feat, and different folks from our team decided to help in different ways. So it definitely took a couple of us. Some of the lessons learned was we talked about rounds versus rolling bases. So for some folks, maybe rounds make sense. For some folks, maybe having applications on a rolling basis year round might make sense, but really thinking about how do we want to do this in the future, and maybe we just want to big amount and just have applications on a rolling basis, or maybe we do want to continue having them in rounds, but knowing that when each round opens, that our team is going to be, you know, very busy, versus rolling basis might be ongoing busy moments when it comes to applications. Fundraising really needs to fit the safety fund. So we'll talk a little bit more about this, but one of the things that we really wanted was that our cash grants would be very, very flexible. So that meant that any funds used for these grants also had to be flexible. And we quickly realized that probably the best way to fund this was going to be through crowdfunding, which we'll talk about a little bit at the end of this PowerPoint, and by reallocating general operation funds. And this can easily become someone's full-time job. So like I said, it ended up taking a lot of our teammates' time. And I think that that's one of the considerations we would like to have in the future and share with you all, that to really plan who's going to be doing things might be really, really helpful as you roll out a safety fund. This is a question that we got a lot. So how do you determine eligibility or criteria for the safety fund? So how do we decide who gets a safety fund? And this is a part where I'm going to ask y'all to engage in the chat box, because I'm really curious to kind of get your experiences and your thoughts on some of these questions. But the first question I have for y'all, and y'all can type it in the chat box, or you know, you can just think about it. You don't have to really engage in the chat box if you don't want. But how do you feel about the words eligibility and criteria? Like when someone tells you eligibility and criteria, how does that feel? And do you feel it anywhere in particular in your body? Okay, I'm seeing a few come in. A hurdle, feels like power. You feel it in your throat. Yeah. Side of ribs, stress. Yeah. Lightheaded, same. Elitist, annoyed. Yeah. So exactly. So these words, I think for a lot of us, and I want to be mindful that a lot of us who do this work have lived experience. So we are survivors ourselves in many different capacities. And I think we've all had to come up against eligibility and criteria in not the funnest ways, right? So I think, so we kept that in mind, you know, like how do we, you know, be very honest about what eligibility and criteria makes us survivors feel, and will make probably the folks that are applying for this feel. Out of curiosity, what are some typical eligibility standards from other financial support applications that you have seen? So please type those in the chat box. So what kind of eligibility standards have y'all seen? Proof, income is a big one, social security number, third party verification, yeah, age, police report, which goes along with proof. So all sorts of proof, whether proof from an advocate, proof from a police report, yeah. So, you know, thinking about all these typical eligibility standards that we have to encounter every day, whether as a survivor or as a person supporting a survivor, we really had to ask ourselves, and hope that you also ask yourself, is what is our work to do with funders, boards, and the general public, and what is the survivor's work to do, right? So where and what are the ways to meet eligibility and criteria in a way that is honest and builds trust? And where do these eligibility and criteria standards come from? Are they actually needed? So, you know, those are questions that are going to be maybe hard to talk about in certain organizations or in certain communities. But really talking about it critically and honestly, as messy and as difficult as it might be, is important. And really thinking about, you know, if proof, why does the public need proof from survivors? And is there anything that we as an advocate or as an organization can do to kind of advocate for the folks that we're serving so that they don't have to provide proof, right? Or is there any education that we can do to kind of help folks understand why asking for something like a police report can be very difficult for survivors. So what did we do? All that we required on our application was your name, are you a survivor? And we included a very inclusive definition of what it meant to be a survivor. So you had to be a survivor to be able to get this grant. How do we communicate with you safely? Which I'll mention we've learned changed throughout the time that we were interacting with the survivor. And how do you want to receive payment? So these are the 4 things that we realized were pretty much the only thing we needed to get money to survivors. Some of the lessons we learned is sometimes communication will not be safe. So there was folks who said, I don't have a safe way to communicate at all. And we just had to trust that and send them money and see, and hopefully they received it, right? So that was just something that we had to trust survivors when they told us. We had to be really flexible about being able to change preferences. So maybe somebody said, I prefer receiving it via check and I prefer being texted, but maybe a week or 2 weeks later that changes. So I want to receive it via PayPal and I actually want to receive a phone call. And we had to be really flexible around that and trust that survivors really knew how to keep themselves safe. And the best thing we could do is listen to them. And we had to be very, very clear about what was optional. So these things that we absolutely needed to give out a grant, we made sure to be very clear about that, and everything else was optional. And we said it was optional many times throughout the application just to make sure that folks really knew. And what we learned was that doing it this way built trust with the folks that we serve. And I think folks were almost expecting a more robust, complicated application. And when they didn't see that, and when they quickly got the money, it really built trust with the folks that we wanted to serve and really allowed them to open up and share a little bit about themselves with us. The next question we got a lot is, what is the difference between restricted and unrestricted? So restricted is money given by donors for a specific reason or program. This also might have more documentation needed to prove that money is being used in a certain way. And then unrestricted, also known as flexible, is money given by donors that can be used for any legal purpose. And by legal purpose, I mean, like, as long as it's not an illegal activity, then you can probably use it, not necessarily like legal programming. Some questions that can be helpful around this, that for yourself or your team, is going back to the question about how this fund will align with your mission. So how does your mission and the purpose of this fund better align with restricted or unrestricted funds? Do you currently have any grants or programs for survivors that are either restricted or unrestricted? And what determined the status? So thinking about, some of the programs that you're already doing, some of the restricted and unrestricted funds that you have, and who determined it, how was that determined? And really thinking about, which one might make the most sense for your fund. Oops, too far. Okay, sorry, y'all. My thing is messing up. There we go. So the Survivor Safety Fund was unrestricted. So it was built a lot on trust and flexibility. So we trusted survivors to use those $250 in a way that they needed. And we also realized that staying safe isn't a one-size-fits-all, so funding shouldn't be either. So like the example that Sharon gave, someone needed to fix their car in order to keep custody of their daughter. We never know what those implications might be, and therefore we need to be really flexible about what folks can use this money for. So we didn't require folks to submit proof. We didn't require folks to use this money in a certain way. We just kind of trusted them. And for the folks that wanted to share with us how the money was used, they could. But some of the lessons that we learned was that supporting survivors early and directly is cost effective. So one of the things that Sharon shared in the beginning of the presentation is that most of them reported that on average they need about $730. So if we think about giving survivors $730, it might be a lot more affordable than some of other programs that maybe don't actually support the safety of survivors or actually support what survivors are asking for. So if survivors are asking for $730, that's not a lot in comparison to some of the funding happening in many different movements. So how about let's just do that. Having unrestricted funding in the budget made it easier to reallocate money to the safety fund. So this is just going back to how we fundraised and how we kind of accounted for money in our organization. So having unrestricted funding that we can use. So that means that a donor is trusting us to use the money in a way that we think is best, allows us to then trust survivors in using the money in a way that they think is best. There was a reluctance to provide survivors with direct cash assistance, which revealed an uncomfortable truth for a lot of us, that as a society, we don't trust survivors to spend money in the right way. And that goes the same applies for organizations, right? Working in the domestic violence or gender-based violence movement. That there's just this deep mistrust in how survivors will use money, deep mistrust in that they will use it in an appropriate way. And it was uncomfortable. And we had to really sit with that, and we had to have a lot of conversations about it. So if you are thinking about doing an unrestricted safety fund, just be prepared to be asked questions like, how do you know people are using the money in the right way, or and having to explain that there is no such thing as right or wrong when it comes to supporting folks through direct cash grants. So just be prepared for those types of conversations. Now we're going to jump a little bit into collecting information from survivors and what data you need and how we should gather it. Sorry, it got a little cut off for me. Yeah. So questions that you should ask yourself or your team, similar to determining eligibility for grants: what information is necessary to pay survivors, and which questions can be optional? Do we have to report any metrics to funders? How can we balance funder requirements with survivors' experiences applying for grants? So again, if you do have funders who maybe require metrics or certain documentation, then that might go into what you gather and how you gather information. What software do you want to use to collect information from survivors? So keeping in mind safety and other considerations, accessibility, for example. What questions can we ask survivors so that our programs and initiatives are driven by survivor needs? So this was really, really important for us. So how do we ask questions to collect information about what they need? And what knowledge gaps can we fill with this project? So there's a lot of knowledge gaps around survivorship and financial challenges. So we saw this opportunity as a way to get some feedback from survivors about their experiences. So like I mentioned before, we required survivors to tell us first and last name, state of residence, whether they identified as a survivor, the safest way to contact them, how much money they needed, and the safest way to pay them. All other questions were optional. So for example, this is an example of a way that we asked the question. If you have a couple minutes extra, we'd be so appreciative if you could answer a few more questions about your current financial situation. We are eager to understand survivors' current needs so we can provide the support folks actually need and urge our partners to do the same. These questions are optional, though, and skipping them won't impact your ability to receive a grant from us. So we were very clear about why we were asking these questions. So we want to collect information to advocate to do more of this work, and that you can skip them, they're optional, and that these questions won't impact your ability to receive a grant from us. Additionally, we were transparent about why we were asking questions to help survivors feel more included in the process. So here's how we framed some of those questions. At FreeFrom, we are advocating for a broader ecosystem of support by survivors for survivors. So we'd like to know from you what you think resources for survivors should look like. So again, allowing them to understand why we're asking these questions and making them part of the solution was really important as we were collecting information from them. And we also use SurveyMonkey. So SurveyMonkey was accessible via phone to folks. SurveyMonkey was just cost effective and secure. So that's why we use SurveyMonkey. The questions we asked survivors were driven by both wanting to hear directly from survivors and also to create initiatives that are survivor driven and understand more about these gaps in knowledge about the experiences of economic abuse. So if you've tried to do economic abuse research, there's still a lot of gaps. And I think one of the reasons is because I think there's a general discomfort with understanding how to collect information from survivors. So it's almost like we don't know how to do it, so maybe let's not. So we were really wanting to kind of fill some of that gap and find a way to collect information from survivors from their first person perspective that could drive some of these gaps in knowledge and start giving us some solutions to some of the challenges that we're experiencing. So survivor needs, we asked things about like what support survivors need during COVID-19, what services they would like to receive from the domestic violence movement, what survivors would like expanded systems of support to look like. So that's like, do you want other people outside of domestic violence to support you? And who are those people and what would that look like? And some of the gaps in knowledge that we were trying to address is the full cost of economic abuse. So we piloted that question about, you know, how much has it cost you? So how much has your harm doer stolen from you, and how much have they taken out in fraudulent debt? And also the financial well-being of survivors in this moment and beyond. So some of the lessons learned was that including more explicit instructions about when an application is complete. So, you know, we gave the choice of not answering non-essential questions, but we had a high volume of incomplete applications. We think including more specific language about when an application is complete would be helpful and result in more complete applications. So because there were so many optional, now folks are a little bit confused about when your application is actually complete. So including more language and information about when that completion happens. Some optional questions were filled out by nearly 90% of applicants, which we think indicates a high level of trust and also signals that survivors are open to participating in research when the process is transparent, optional, and related to the receipt of flexible, non-questioned asked funds. So again, there's a lot of there's a hesitation to include survivors in research and how to do that. So I think the answers that we received, the high volume of answers that we received, showed that doing it in this way, in a transparent, optional, and related to some sort of flexible, no questions asked funds, really helps survivors feel comfortable with participating in research, but also meet some of the financial needs that they may have. How to communicate with applicants. You know, we, like Sharon said, we had 1,300 different surveys completed. So some of the things that you might want to ask yourself is what typically works for your clients? Which mediums of communication are safe? So email, text, mail, or none? Do you have funding to support communication app software specifically for bulk text messaging? So like softwares that allow you to text a lot of folks at once, or a lot of folks in a short period of time. Who in your team will communicate with survivors? How will you handle difficult conversations or challenges with survivors? So, you know, maybe something happens and there is a conversation happening via text or email or over the phone, and how will those challenges be handled? What might come up for our staff as they are communicating with survivors? So that's something also important to keep in mind, that folks are going to be sharing a little bit about themselves. Sometimes they might share a little bit about what they're experiencing, and what might come up for your staff as they're communicating with survivors, and really preparing them and giving them a space to unpack what they're experiencing, but also heal anything that may come up for themselves, especially if your staff are survivors. So in the safety fund, the way that we communicated with survivors is we gave them the option to tell us how they wanted us to communicate, and then also change it. So the options were email, text, or no form at all. And like I said, sometimes that changed. So we allowed them to let us know when that was going to change. Some of the lessons learned is that you really need to have trauma-informed staff communicate with survivors because of all the things that are happening, and really somebody who understands that, you know, sometimes you'll hear from a survivor very quickly, sometimes it might take more time, but you know, someone who's going to be patient and really be able to engage with that survivor as long as they need in order for the grants to actually get to them safely and beyond. So texting as a form of communication was only manageable with software that allows for bulk texting. So a lot of us run into, you know, being maxed out because we sent too many texts through like something like Google Phone. So that's something a future consideration to take, is really looking into software that allow you to text large capacities, if that's what you're thinking about doing. Using a designated email for responses. So we use safetyfund@freefrom.org to be able to track conversations more effectively. The next is, how do we distribute the funds? You know, we did so much work already. Now the fun part is here. So how do we get the money to people? Asking yourself things like, are these flexible grants? So that's important, right, in figuring out how you're going to distribute them. Because if they're not flexible, then you might need some sort of documentation, and that's going to determine how you're going to distribute funds. If they're more flexible, then of course your distribution channels might be a little bit more flexible. How can you be mindful of how to safely get these grants to survivors? What payment options typically work for the populations you work with? Are there any accounting considerations to be mindful of, such as staff time, check signing, etc.? How soon can you distribute payments, and how long do those processes take? And how will you handle payments that aren't received or lost? So what we ended up doing is we gave folks the option of check, direct deposit, and PayPal, and folks were able to change this whenever they needed. Some of the lessons learned were that addresses used in the application changed from the moment that the application was sent to the moment that, you know, it was time to distribute the fund. So one of the things that we thought about was to collect disbursement and payment information closer to the date of disbursement to make sure that money is going to the right place. Apps such as Venmo and Cash App were preferred methods of payment. So those weren't one of the options that we had, but we got those requests, so that's something to consider. Direct deposit took longer than we expected. So, and I think when you're communicating with folks, it's really important to give them as much accurate information as you can. So understanding how long it takes to receive direct deposit can help you have accurate and honest conversations with folks. And lost checks required extra time to follow up, of course. So that required more conversations with the survivor and just more work on our end to make sure that was resolved. All right, so I'm gonna hand it off to Sharon.
All right, so the question we're all asking ourselves, how do we raise money for this? How do we fundraise to give unrestricted cash grants, right? So I think Tanya mentioned this a little bit earlier, but when we think about the questions that we want to ask ourselves and your team is, when we think about restricted versus unrestricted, and how do you give and what kind of funds do you provide, we want to think about what does it say about your fundraising strategy and who might your best funders be. So a government fund may not be the best for an unrestricted cash grant like this, because there are a lot of restrictions and qualifications that come with a government grant. We also want to think about what is the fundraising goal. For us, we provided over 1,000 cash grants of $250, but maybe your organization is not in the place to do something of that scale. So thinking about maybe it's $500 grants to 10 survivors, or $250 grants to 200 survivors, right? So you want to think about what makes the most sense for your organization, the capacity of the staff, as well as thinking about what is the fund, how do you fundraise for this? So we're gonna, in the next slide, we're gonna get into a little bit of how we fundraise for it, but you really want to think about how do you and your team fundraise for it, and whether or not do you to have public sponsors or to not have public sponsors. And for this, we really want to think about the people that you may be partnering with or co-branding with. What does that say to the group of survivors that you are working with? Does it build trust, or does it build mistrust if there is some sort of history, or if there is an issue or something that has previously come up with that organization that you may want to be partnering with or co-branding with? So how we fundraise for the safety fund was, at the very beginning, we launched the GoFundMe. It was one of the first things that we did to fundraise for the safety fund. And I grabbed the screenshot about a day ago. And to date, our GoFundMe has raised $118,000, almost $119,000. And this was all private donations. We had people donating anywhere between $5 to $2,500. And we launched this back in, I believe it was in April. And we also had private donors. So people who saw our GoFundMe, but they wanted to send us a check. We had private donations from folks who were previous donors already. And we finally had to reallocate some of our unrestricted funds. as Tanya mentioned earlier, we do, the majority of our budget is unrestricted funding. So because of that, we were able to figure out where in our budget can we pull some of this money and reallocate it to the safety fund because we're not doing X, Y, and Z this year. And some of the lessons that we learned and some of the funding ideas that you can participate for your own organization is crowdfunding. Obviously, it worked for us in the ways that we promoted it on social media. Some of our staff promoted it on their own personal social media pages, talking to our donors. You can also do an individual giving campaign specifically for your private donations and specifically for a safety fund of your own. We talk to a lot of corporate and foundational donors, and this is sometimes where you may need to have those difficult conversations that Tanya was talking about trusting survivors and why you're providing unrestricted grants versus restricted grants and not expecting quote unquote proof of survivorship. And also looking at your own budget to see, is there anywhere in your budget where you already have unrestricted funds that you can reallocate to the safety funds for this year? And finally, funder education. Talking to funders, it's going back to what is our work as an organization, what is our work as staff to have these difficult conversations with our funders on why it is so important to provide unrestricted funding, and then really creating an ecosystem where we can have funders participate in unrestricted safety grants for survivors based on trust them, funders trusting the organization and organizations trusting the survivors. All right, so resources that we will be offering and sending to all of you is we will be providing the roadmap. So basically it's a roadmap on all of the different steps. It's a brief summary of one pager on how you can start your own safety fund at your organization. We'll also be sending you our report again. So the Survivors Know Best report, it has a lot of good information and data. We'll be sending you the PowerPoint as well as the recording of this webinar. And a really great resource is the National Alliance for Safe Housing. They provide technical assistance to organizations hoping or looking to start an unrestricted cash grant program. So they are a great resource if you have additional questions or just need some technical assistance for your organization. And finally, working with Free From, this is just one of our initiatives that came up this year, but there's a lot of other things that we do at Free From. So if you're interested in starting a safety fund or you want to train your staff, if you are part of a nonprofit and you want to train your staff on how to work with survivors with their finances, you can contact Tanya. If you want to talk to survivors or if you want to help survivors start a peer-to-peer financial support group, so creating community power, you can contact M. Jackson at their email address there. We also have a compensation compass that is a really easy tech tool that helps survivors navigate seeking compensation for the harm that they endured, and that's our link. We also have a systems change work where we are working with employers and workplaces to create a more survivor-centered workplace. And we also do policy work in all 50 states. So you can contact Sabrina for that. And this will, again, be in the I will send you the PowerPoint so you don't have to write all the email addresses down. So there's a lot of different things we do at Free From. So please reach out to us. And I'm going to open up for questions. I know we had a couple of questions in the Q&A box, but if any of you have questions, myself and Tanya, as well as Deanna and Kirk, we are available for questions.
Thank you. It's helpful if y'all ask in the actual Q&A box versus the chat, so that we can just sort through them a lot quicker, but also feel free to engage in questions in any way that's meaningful. So we got a question about, do you have any experience using CARES Act funds for this? I don't believe we used any CARES Act funds, but Deanna or Kirkley, do y'all know differently? Yeah, I don't think we used any CARES Act funds for this. So there's a question about if we actually tried Cash App or Venmo. It looks like it got answered, but the answer for that one was, where'd it go? We did not use Venmo or Cash App this time around, but we are considering using it next time. Any suggestions for bringing this up to your boss? The report, I think, is a really great place to start. So the report has a lot of great data that can help you make an argument for this. Of course, depending on where you're working, folks might be a little bit more receptive to it versus not. But if you have a board or directors or management that is more data driven, the report has a lot of great data that you can use to really make a case for this. Yeah, so somebody asked about getting more information about getting compensation for survivors for the harm that they endured. So we have something called the Compensation Compass. So if you go on our website, which is www.freefrom.org, and it's on this slide, there'll be a button at the top that says Get Compensation. If you click that, survivors can answer a series of questions that will give them state-specific information about what are the avenues to compensation in their state, and it'll have like almost like self-help guided instructions on how to seek those different avenues of compensation.
Deanna, can you answer? I think there was a question that was asking if we disbursed money to more than one survivor.
Someone talked about, can you talk more about being mindful of the power dynamic, giving, receiving money, I'm assuming, and how these conversations played out? I think this conversation happened a lot when we're thinking about what is required and what is optional and how do we ask these questions. So we really didn't want to make survivors feel like they had to tell us anything to get the money, right? And we had to be mindful of that. Even if we're telling folks that certain questions are optional, they might still, because of previous experiences asking for support, they might still feel like they have to. So that's why we put so many reminders everywhere to try to make it as clear as possible. And we're very honest about, these questions have zero impact on whether or not you will get the grant or not. So that's a little bit about how those conversations went and when they came into play. Somebody asked, do you include indirect costs of sexual assault in your report? I don't know if we gave a breakdown. Kirkley, you might be able to answer that one a little better, and feel free to unmute yourself. But I don't think we gave a breakdown on exactly what folks were using or like the costs that they took on because of the harm that they endured. But Kirkley, I don't know. I think there might be some other research that does that, but Kirkley, if you have anything else to add to that, please do. Somebody asked, is our fund still open to requests for survivors? At this moment, they are closed, but we are actively fundraising to be able to open that back up again.
Just to jump in on the indirect costs, we don't explicitly talk about a breakdown of those types of costs in the report, but we do have survivors who wrote in saying that they use the funds to pay for therapy or other types of costs related to past experiences with abuse. So some survivors did use the funds that way, but we didn't break the costs down as direct or indirect, if that makes sense.
Thank you, Kirkley. Somebody asked about the average grant people need was 730, which seems low, especially for people living in urban areas, places with higher cost of living. Was this amount consistent across the country, or were there a wide range based on where people lived? Kirkley, do you want to share a little bit about how we found that number?
Yeah, so it's a great question. We talk about it a little bit in the report, but this number, we were surprised by how low this number was as well, but it was remarkably consistent. So even from our first 20 applicants, just when we started this program, to now over 1,300 responses, that number has hovered between $700 and $800 the whole time. And so we think it's a really interesting number, and we're also really believe that it's indicative of what survivors need. And now one thing, and we talk about this in the report, is that we didn't put a timestamp on that. So we didn't ask survivors, how long will this last or anything. We just asked what they needed right now. So we assumed it was to help them, immediately move towards safety. And so we can't talk about the timeline of how that money is useful, but it was really consistent.
Thank you. We have a question about what channel was most successful for fundraising. Diana, do you have an idea of where most of the money for this fund came from, whether it was through the GoFundMe or other sources? And make sure you unmute yourself, Diana. There you go.
Sorry. It was mostly done through social media using our the GoFundMe that we had created. That's where the majority of donations came through.
Thank you. So we only have a few minutes, so if we don't get to all your questions, don't worry, we're gonna grab them and make sure we answer them in the follow-up email. Let's see, what else do we have? So someone had a question about fundraising when you can't have live events. I think some of the things that we suggested on here, which may or may not work, is crowdfunding, going to individual donors, and just fundraising outside of live sources. This one's for you, Diana, so unmute yourself. But someone is curious if we had an incident where we had to refuse payment, or in other words, couldn't support somebody with a grant.
No, I don't recall having to refuse payment to anyone. No, I mean, there was some confusions around like duplicates and so forth, but not really refusing payment to anyone. We didn't have that issue.
Thank you. Someone asks, do nonprofit orgs receive more funding for this than unofficial orgs? I mean, it could. It's just that having nonprofit status allows you to apply for certain types of funding. So it really depends. There are a lot of community-based mutual aid funds that have been able to raise quite a large amount of money through crowdfunding. But it really just depends on the initiative and how their fundraising strategy. But yes, having a nonprofit status does allow you to apply for different kinds of funding, like with foundations and so on and so forth. Do we have information in Spanish? I think it depends on what kind of information. So we have our application in Spanish. We do not have the report in Spanish. So if you want to follow up with us about what kind of Spanish resources you're looking for, we can definitely support you with that. And I think I saw a couple questions about whether we do financial education or financial literacy training. And just to close up our call, yes, we do. That's actually what Sharon and I do. We support IPV organizations, and we train staff working in the movement on how to do financial work with survivors in a trauma-informed and survivor-centered way. So if you're curious about that, definitely reach out to me, and I'd be happy to set up a call to talk more. And that is all the time we had. We had a couple more questions, so Sharon will probably grab those and make sure that we get to them. But thank you all so much. I hope that you found this webinar helpful and insightful, and definitely feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions that you couldn't answer today, and let us know how we can support you all as you think about opening safety funds. Thank you and have a lovely day. Bye.